He's here. Now, broadcasting from the underground command post, deep in the bowels of a hidden bunker, somewhere under the brick and steel of a nondescript building, we've once again made contact with our leader, Mark Levin.
Everybody, Mark Levin here. Our number 877-381-3811, 877-381-3811. You know, a few years back I had my buddy Professor Paul Kengor on this program, and several times since, and I had him on Life, Liberty, and Levin, and we talked at great length about an individual's role, a prominent individual's role, interfering with our election process in the time period of around 1984, the re-election of Ronald Reagan. And what's amazing to me is the extent to which this prominent individual sought to interfere in that election became known when that prominent individual was alive, and not a single major news outlet was interested. Professor Kengor, how are you, my friend?
Good, Mark. Hey, good to be back on with you. By the way, great Life, Liberty, and Levin with Peter Schweizer last week. All right. It was fantastic.
Thank you. All right, I want to get right into this. The individual was Senator Ted Kennedy. He'd been a leader of the Democrat Party. He's the so-called Lion of the Senate. He's an individual who wanted to be president in 1980, the Democrat primary with Jimmy Carter, and he wanted to run again. Tell us the story slowly and clearly of what Ted Kennedy did with the Soviets.
Well, that's right. In fact, he wanted to run again in 1984. He had a little problem called Chappaquiddick in the background, right? Drunk driving, an uncharged, perhaps a vehicular homicide situation. But never charged for that, got away with it. And what you're asking me about, well, this was a KGB document, so we actually have this. I've got it right in front of me in Russian and in English. It was May 14th, 1983, from the Committee on State Security in the USSR, that's the KGB, and the title of it is Regarding Senator Kennedy's Request to the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Y.V. Andropov, and that's Yuri Andropov, the horrible dictator of the USSR. And so that's who the letter is to. It's a classified KGB memo. It's written by Viktor Chebrakov, the head of the KGB, and it says right off in the first sentence, on 9-10 May of this year, Senator Edward Kennedy's close friend and trusted confidant, Jay Tunney, was in Moscow. And Jay Tunney was an old law school roommate of Ted Kennedy. He was a senator. He had been a senator from California. And by the way, he just died recently. And no one pursued him on this either, on Tunney. But it says in the very first paragraph of the memo, the senator charged Tunney to convey the following message through confidential contacts to the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Yuri Andropov. And then it goes on to say that Kennedy, like other rational people, that actually says that, has been very troubled about U.S.-Soviet relations, about what's happened in the last few years of the Cold War, and it blames this, Mark, on Reagan's belligerence. Reagan's belligerence. In fact, it even says, according to Kennedy, the current threat is due to the president's refusal to engage any modification in his politics. And then it goes on to mention Reagan's situation. This could bring about the fall of the presidential campaign of 1984. And then it says the only real potential threats to Reagan are problems of war and peace in Soviet-American relations. So the memo goes on to list some suggestions here from Kennedy as to where Reagan is weak, quote, still very weak, where he's vulnerable, where there could be chink in his armor in the presidential campaign and rerunning in 1984, running again in 1984. And then it says, in this regard, Kennedy offers the following proposals to Andropov. It goes down through a list of a bunch of proposals, including Kennedy meeting with Andropov, Kennedy going to Moscow, Andropov and other political and military officials coming to the United States, and I mean, much more. It goes on and on with this. And the key, of course, is that this is done confidentially. This document was released in 1992. It was broke by the London Times. From there, it was never reported by a single American newspaper. I got it and published it in a book on Reagan called The Crusader, first in 2005. Published it again in a book called Dupes, published in 2010. Again, published it in Russian and in English. And I never got, and still to this day have not received, even after doing your show last year, which must have been watched by a gazillion people because I probably got 1,000 emails on it, I still have never received a single call from the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, ABC, CNN, none of them. They've completely ignored it.
So this document is available since 1992.
That's right. That's right.
Ted Kennedy is alive after the document comes out.
Yeah, for quite a while. I think almost 2 decades.
He passes away, I don't remember when. Was it 2007, something of that sort?
Yeah, something like that. I think even after that.
Okay.
He was around for plenty of time to respond to this.
And he's never asked about it. There's not a single hearing about it. Clearly, the Democrats don't care about it. This was a massive effort to get the Soviets to interfere in our election, wasn't it?
Well, it was definitely Kennedy making an overture to Moscow through confidential contacts, as even the memo itself says, and we don't know what the response was. We don't know what.
No, I didn't say the response. This was a major effort to get the Soviet Union to interfere in our election. You just read from the memo.
Yeah, I think it's fair to characterize it that way. And comparing this, I'm so glad that you asked me to come on, because comparing this, I've thought about this in the last couple of weeks, especially after watching you and Peter last week on your show. If you were to compare this to Trump and Biden today, now imagine if Ronald Reagan knew about this memo, Mark, right, in 1984. Right, after Ted Kennedy's shenanigans. Right. And he knows that Kennedy's considering a challenge to Reagan in 1984. And imagine if Reagan's frustration, if he would have known that no one in the media cared to even ask Kennedy about this, right? Mm-hmm. Imagine what Reagan's frustration would be like. Imagine the temptation of Reagan to try to do what he would be able to do, or his staff could do, to try to expose what Kennedy did, knowing that no one in the liberal media was going to expose it or even bother to ever report on it. And then if Reagan would have done so, or someone in his staff would have tried to call attention to it, Reagan would have been accused by the liberal media of abusing his power because he'd be facing a possible presidential campaign challenge by Ted Kennedy in 1984. And I think that's what Donald Trump is facing with Joe Biden. Right? If Trump wants the liberal media to do its job and expose how Biden abused power, knowing that the liberal media won't do it, so Trump knows that he has to try to expose it himself. And, you know, as you've written about, Mark, when you have a free press that doesn't genuinely do its job, that instead acts as a political arm of the Democratic Party, well, this is the kind of thing that can happen. And so you can imagine Trump's frustration after 2 or 3 years of the liberal media 24/7 accusing him of collaborating with the Russians, and then seeing the things that he's seeing from the Bidens, plural, with the Ukraine, with China, wherever else, knowing that the liberal media is not going to do a damn thing to report it. And so he probably feels like, all right, well, at least if I can raise the issue in press conferences or wherever, somebody's got to do the job that the liberal media won't do, or at least won't do when it involves the liberal media's own candidates.
I think that's a very, very important takeaway. My other takeaway, or another takeaway, would be no interest in it whatsoever. In other words, here we have a brazen effort to stop Reagan, and he's trying to enlist the Soviets That's what he's done. They have a whole list of ideas that he's given the Soviets, according to this memo. Whether they did it or not is secondary. He's trying to enlist the Soviets. We don't know if it ever happened or not because nobody questioned that. There was never a hearing about any of this, was there?
Yeah, no, there was never a hearing, and in fact, the very specific proposals, it says here, this is striking language, Kennedy believes that in order to influence Americans, I mean, imagine just that language right there. It would be important to organize in August, September of this year, and then he goes on and gives specific ideas, including televised interviews with Andropov in the USA, a direct appeal by the General Secretary of the Communist Party to the American people, it says. So he's laying out specific steps that the Soviets could take in order to try to deal with this problem of Reagan and Reagan's belligerence, and with the election right around the corner. So it's and this is done confidentially.
I'll tell you why. I'm really focused on this, because in the book I just wrote on freedom of the press, I see what John Kennedy did with the IRS and the FBI against his political opponents. I see what Lyndon Johnson did with the IRS and the FBI against his political opponents. I see what Richard Nixon did. No defense of Nixon. But if he's going to be forced to resign, the other two should have been forced to resign, because they used the IRS, they used the tax returns, they used the FBI to intercept phone conversations. Frankly, so did Franklin Roosevelt. And yet Nixon goes down. Again, not a defense of Nixon. I'm just talking about the inequality of this. And now I see Trump, where they're actually trying to rewrite the phone transcript in order to get it. And I hear it. He said he wanted a favor for, and then they skipped down about 500 words. And I'm thinking to myself, this is yet another perfect example where I hear time and time again, can you give us an example in modern history when somebody did this, tried to interfere in an election? First of all, Trump wasn't trying to interfere in an election, but Ted Kennedy actually was.
Well, that's right. And also, I mean, look at the abuses with the IRS just in the Obama administration recently. And of course, FDR, I mean, we could go on and on and on with the abuses under FDR. They're amazing.
Be careful. Conrad Black wouldn't want to hear about it.
Right, that's very true.
Yes.
And also too with the Trump Zelensky phone call on the Ukraine, the entire thing was released. The entire transcript is released, and so, I mean, imagine if he would have tried to hold it up, right, saying that this is classified. Then they'd be screaming Nixon, Watergate all over again. I think what's fascinating about President Trump right now is that he's really going on the offensive by just simply doing these things out in the open, right? He's basically saying, look, I know you're not going to cover whatever the Bidens did or are doing in China and elsewhere, so I'm going to walk out in a press conference and talk to all of you and just say, yeah, I'll call on the Chinese to look into this if need be. And this is what happens when the media doesn't do its job.
And by the way, I love politicians like Romney and others. We're asking the Chinese to investigate. Do these people understand that we have FBI field offices all over the world where we work, I don't know about China, but we work with all these governments, all of them, to conduct investigations, and we ask them to conduct investigations because we're in their country. Whatever it is, whether it's drug cases, embezzlement cases, terrorism cases, fraud cases, tax cases, many of these cases, we can't get these things done but for the fact that foreign governments are helping us.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And in that phone call with Zelensky from the Ukraine, I think President Trump, I actually went through and counted. I think he mentions Barr 6 or 7 times. Rudy Giuliani, I think 5 times. Biden is mentioned, I think, 3 times, but he clearly, I think he was reading from notes or talking points in that conversation, because he very clearly tells Zelensky, I want you to work through my Office of Attorney General. I want you to work through my attorney on this. So he's really establishing an actual process there channels, legal channels, proper channels that Zelensky and the Ukrainians could work through. And so I think that's a very important thing. To me, Mark, that the transcript of that phone conversation actually reads like a transcript that Trump knew would and could become public. And by the way, I can tell you, as somebody who researches presidential records and phone calls, at some point, as every president knows, surely knows, or at least ought to know, or is told early in his administration, that stuff does get declassified. It does become public.
All right,
So
Professor, I've got to go. I've got a break here. Thank you very, very much. As always, I appreciate it, my friend. We'll be right back.
Much love in.